Okay, kinesiology 230, chapter number 5, presentation number 9. This is the last one from the book content. There is one additional presentation that we'll put in Blackboard for you that'll be specific to kind of like tying in a few concepts. But this is a presentation that'll be on the factors that influence adaptations. This will be on a chronic side. This will be specificity of exercise, sex of the person, age, and genetics. Let's jump in. So here we are, right? We're in this section's factors that influence adaptations to resistance training. I got a little overtraining and detraining at the end. The book really doesn't put too much emphasis on these. I can tell you from a program design standpoint, these are pretty darn important, but it's just not in the purview of the book here. So we're going to just kind of gloss over them, but we'll hit them. So here we are. The factors that influence adaptations for resistance training. The ones that they list are these 4: specificity, sex, age, and genetics. And within the context of that, I talk about specificity in training. I've alluded to this already a couple of times when I talk about track and field. It's usually the easiest way to kind of conceptually wrap yourself around it. It's a concept that a body will have a specific adaptation to specific exercise stressor. And it also enters the conversation when we're talking about creating programming that's going to meet specific goals. So, if we have 2 different athletes who are in track and field, your distance runner is going to have very different athletic demands than the thrower. So to that end, my programming for my thrower will be way different than my programming for my cross-country athletes or my distance runners. So you have to be cognizant of this when you're doing program design, and also when you start talking about specificity of training for a sport. And it becomes specificity of training when you're working with a client. If you want a particular result, you're going to have a particular training and programming design to match that, to apply the right stressor to get the results you want. The book lists that when you talking about sex, males and females respond to resistance training similarly, and we're all muscle and mitochondria, right? So at the end of the day, it's still the same muscle fiber. There are some differences though. And the differences that we see, it's like the differences we see in strength between the 2 sexes. And they attribute that to mostly body size and body composition, but also testosterone and estrogen, the main hormones that each sex has coursing through its bodies. Now, I will say this, and the book highlights this, and I think it's great. When you start to look at and evaluate and level the playing field, when we start talking about pound for pound explosiveness or cross-sectional area of muscle and performance, and you have this kind of equalizing factor, then you start to see the margin between the men or the males and the females really tighten up, and it's kind of negligible at that point because, again, getting back to the original conversation, muscle is muscle, whether it's on a male body or a female body. So when you look at it, you get to here, and they make this point when they talk about a per unit of muscle cross-sectional area, sex differences are negligible. Furthermore, muscle architecture characteristics are similar between males and females. Thus, it appears force production capability of a given amount of muscle is not affected by whether one is male or female. But I think it's interesting because they go through the first part of the chapter talking about how there are measurable differences in strength. So there are measurable differences in performance, but it's attributed to this. The differences are attributed to body size and body composition, but when it comes down to a cellular level, we're all the same. Moving on. With age, all right? With age, you have, and this is kind of my wheelhouse where I work with my retired folks in the retirement community as well as teach at Harper. You have people who have a sedentary lifestyle, and what they'll do is they'll have a loss of muscle mass during the aging process. And it starts usually about age 30, you start to see this decline in muscle mass in people who are sedentary. Different from people who are working out, right? That process slows a ton. Matter of fact, you can keep putting muscle on deep into your 50s. I mean, for God's sakes, it just depends upon the person. But what you have is this process called sarcopenia, which is this decline in muscle mass due to aging. And you also have like this ability to generate force, right, diminishes as well. And you also see the ability to, you lose the ability to generate force, but the decline in the ability to produce force and the ability to do so happens rather rapidly. And so it's a matter of now a conversation of, is it the fiber type that erodes rapidly, right? Is it the firing that actually rapidly erodes? Is it a combination therein? And the book doesn't really elaborate on this, and this can be a deep dive study if you guys want to look into it on your own. But you can look at the effects of aging and power production, and what you see is, in general, the demise of a sprinter is much faster than a demise of a distance runner because of the power component that kind of disappears on people as they get older. Interesting stuff to read into. Hopefully you'll find some on it and you'll like it. Part of this is based off of genetics, but also part of this, as we age, there's another component which we'll get to in a second. And I cut off part of it, sorry guys. But you have different somatotypes that are a result of our genetic predisposition, but also of our environmental, right? So you have kind of a nature-nurture thing going on here. We're all born with a genetic predisposition to be ecto, endo, or meso, or kind of a combination thereof. Ecto, very lean and thin. Endo, a little bit more rotund, if you will. Meso, a little bit more athletic, kind of in the middle, meso. And then, if a person wants to be more athletic or have a particular body type, then they're going to need to pick their parents more carefully, right? And that's just the nature of the beast in terms of we are who we are. And it's kind of, you just got to shake what your mama gave you. And it's the result of a genetic predisposition that's been given to us by our parents. There's nothing you can do about it. You can work out as much as you want, but you still have a genetic predisposition to be who you are. Now, when it comes to the chromosome component, that chromosome component is a double helix that we see in DNA, and this is not a genealogy class or a genetics class, so we're not going to get too far into it. But I can tell you, when you go through the process of aging, and like I'm dealing with an aging population in my work, it comes down to these guys right here, the telomeres. They're kind of the protective caps that are on the ends of the chromosomes in the DNA. And what happens is, over time, these caps they start off thick, but they get thinner, thinner, thinner. Every time our DNA reprints itself, these guys will get thinner and thinner and thinner over time, to the point where there isn't protection anymore. And that's where you start to see genetic problems, or you start to see mutations happen in the DNA itself. And you have things like cancer kind of creep into the equation, because the chromosomes can no longer protect themselves. Long story short, where I'm going with all this is, you have a genetic predisposition, and with that, it's based off of our DNA profile. There are some effects of DNA that we have as we age. There's only so much you can do. And that base code that they talk about in the book, we have 2 copies of roughly 20,000 genes, 1 from each parent. And then the genetic potential regarding gaining muscle mass, increasing strength, or losing fat are all caused by slight differences in genetic code or gene variants, which is right down here. And what they get into is this ACTN. And within ACTN, this is the alpha actinin 3 gene, predisposes the person to be stronger. If you read through this once, it'll confuse you. If you read through it 2 more times, you'll be completely confused in terms of how they do, like, actin XX and actin RX or RR genotypes, etc. What I want you to understand from this is, just understand, when you have the actin 3 gene, it predisposes the person to be stronger. There can be mutations in there where it goes from actin XX to actin RX or RR, where it's a different mutation that's not something you want. But the gene itself is, and the way they describe it, is responsible for producing the structural Z-line proteins. If you remember that with the sarcomere, everything happens in between the Z's. And what they state in the book is, the actin gene, ACTN gene, is responsible for producing structural Z-line proteins that are found in type 2 muscle fibers. So you can just imagine a type 2 muscle fiber. This is responsible for this. If you have this gene mutation that allows for the greater production of ACTN, and it's the ACTN3, then you have a predisposition to being stronger. They list it in terms of, it's the strength and power or athletic gene by mainstream entities. And that might be something, if you want to look it up, you can take a look. And it's where the strength happens, right? We know the strength happens, as we talked before, down here in the sarcomere level. And if you're able to take your Z line, your Zweichen on one side, your Zweichen on the other, and you're able to have a more forceful contraction as a result of that because of this genetic predisposition through this actin 3 gene, you're going to be stronger and more powerful. The book goes into overtraining and detraining. I could spend an hour talking about this, but I'm not going to. I'm going to just kind of breeze right through it. So when a training program has too high of intensity or volume, or what's called total volume load, the person can be physically or mentally stale. You kind of get burnt out on working out, or maybe physically you're just too sore, you're achy, you end up with an injury, an acute injury or a chronic injury from something like this. The gains start to plateau. You really don't have the desire to work out anymore. Greater likelihood, like I said, to become injured. Good program design will give consideration to manipulating and training variables. That's AKA periodization, like I talked about before. And it will give consideration to the influence that maybe strength training has on conditioning, and conditioning has on strength training. They go lockstep, they run dovetail. If you have your athletes and you're asking them to do heavy power cleans and then you're sending them out to do a 5-mile run, that is counterintuitive. So you got to understand they work together, and your programming has to reflect that. So when a person stops an exercise program, they'll go through detraining. It's a reversal. It's a reversal of physiological adaptations that we've seen and experienced while training. What you see is muscular atrophy, motor coordination diminishes, flexibility, all the things that you've built up over time diminish. And what you see is higher intensity training programs retain performance better than lower intensity programs. So the idea that you can do just low level basic kind of aerobic training and just jump out and jump back in, what you see is with this higher intensity training programs is you see it diminish, like in the ability to generate force because it's type 2 fibers. But what happens is the body actually bounces back faster with the type 2 fibers in the higher intensity training programs. Interesting little dichotomy there. The book points out between the two things in terms of how type 1 and type 2 respond to training, how type 1 and type 2 respond to detraining. All right, guys, signing off. Have a good one.